Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was being handcuffed by FBI agents in the parking lot of a Dallas community center, accused of federal election interference and conspiracy to manipulate voting systems just 6 weeks before the midterm elections. The 43-year-old Texas representative found herself facing up to 20 years in federal prison while FBI agent Patricia Williams read her Miranda rights, convinced that America's most outspoken voting rights advocate had crossed the line from activism into criminal election tampering. But what Agent Williams and her federal task force didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had just uncovered the largest voter suppression operation in Texas history, a systematic scheme to disenfranchise thousands of minority voters that reached into the highest levels of state government and threatened the integrity of American democracy itself. The investigation had begun 3 weeks earlier when constituents in Jasmine Crockett's district started reporting unusual problems with their voter registrations. Longtime residents who had voted in every election for decades were suddenly being told their registrations were invalid. College students were receiving notices that their addresses couldn't be verified. Elderly voters were being informed that their signatures didn't match previous records, despite having arthritis and other conditions that naturally changed their handwriting over time. Initially, Crockett assumed these were typical administrative errors that occurred before every major election, the kind of bureaucratic confusion that affected all communities but disproportionately impacted minority and low-income voters who had fewer resources to fight registration challenges. But as more reports came in, she began noticing patterns that suggested something more systematic and intentional than random bureaucratic incompetence. The complaints weren't randomly distributed across her district. They were concentrated in specific neighborhoods, predominantly Black and Hispanic communities that historically voted Democratic. The registration challenges weren't affecting suburban areas with higher incomes and education levels. Most telling, the problems seemed to be targeting first-time voters, college students, and people who had recently moved. Exactly the demographic groups that voting rights experts knew were most vulnerable to suppression tactics. Working with her staff and local voting rights organizations, Crockett began systematically documenting the registration challenges and looking for connections between the affected voters. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Someone with access to official voter databases was using sophisticated data analysis to identify and target specific categories of voters for removal or challenge, using pretexts that appeared legitimate but were being applied selectively to achieve partisan political goals. "Congresswoman, this isn't normal election administration," explained Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a voting rights expert from the University of Texas who was helping analyze the data. "Someone is using voter registration databases to conduct what amounts to surgical strikes against specific communities. The sophistication suggests access to state election systems and professional-level data analysis capabilities." Crockett realized that if her preliminary findings were accurate, they were looking at a federal crime that violated multiple civil rights laws and election statutes. The systematic targeting of minority voters based on demographic characteristics wasn't just unethical political strategy. It was illegal voter suppression that could affect the outcome of congressional races, state legislative contests, and local elections across Texas. Rather than simply filing complaints with election officials who might be part of the problem, Crockett decided to conduct her own investigation using her congressional resources and legal authority to request documents and interviews. It was a risky strategy that put her in potential conflict with state election officials, but she believed the evidence of systematic suppression was too serious to trust to normal administrative channels. Using her position on the House Oversight Committee, Crockett began requesting voter registration records, correspondence between election officials, and documentation of the processes being used to challenge voter eligibility. Her requests were initially met with cooperation, but as she pressed for more detailed information and internal communications, state officials began pushing back, claiming her investigation was interfering with legitimate election administration. The resistance from state election officials only reinforced Crockett's suspicions that something significant was being hidden. Legitimate election administration should be transparent and defensible, especially to congressional oversight. The fact that officials were becoming evasive and defensive suggested they had something to hide, encouraging Crockett to dig deeper into the systems and processes they were trying to protect from scrutiny. Working late nights and weekends, Crockett and her staff began cross-referencing voter registration challenges with demographic data, voting history, and geographic information. The patterns that emerged were damning. The registration challenges were being applied almost exclusively to voters in communities that historically supported Democratic candidates, using criteria that were selectively enforced to achieve maximum partisan impact while maintaining plausible deniability. But as Crockett's investigation gained momentum and began attracting media attention, it also caught the attention of federal law enforcement officials who were monitoring election-related activities for signs of interference or manipulation. FBI agent Patricia Williams, who led a task force focused on election security, began receiving reports that a member of Congress was conducting unauthorized investigations into state election systems and potentially interfering with legitimate administrative processes. Agent Williams had 20 years of experience investigating election crimes, from vote buying to registration fraud to foreign interference. When she received reports that Congresswoman Crockett was demanding access to voter databases, questioning election officials, and making public statements about alleged suppression, her initial assessment was that a politician was overstepping legal boundaries in pursuit of partisan advantage. Agent Williams, we're getting reports that Congresswoman Crockett is conducting some kind of unauthorized investigation into voter registration systems, her supervisor informed her. She's demanding access to sensitive election data, making accusations against state officials, and potentially interfering with legitimate election administration just weeks before a major election. We need to determine if she's crossed the line from oversight into criminal interference. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation into Crockett's activities, focusing on whether her requests for voter data and her public statements about alleged suppression constituted illegal interference with election processes. From the federal agent's perspective, a member of Congress using her official position to pressure state election officials and access sensitive voting data could represent a serious threat to election integrity. What the FBI agents didn't understand was that Crockett's investigation had already uncovered substantial evidence of the very election crimes they were supposed to be investigating. While they were focused on her methods and potential overreach, she was documenting systematic violations of federal voting rights laws that threatened thousands of citizens' constitutional rights to participate in elections. The federal investigation escalated when Crockett's staff attempted to access additional voter registration data through official congressional channels. FBI agents monitoring electronic communications flagged these requests as potential evidence of unauthorized access to election systems, not recognizing them as legitimate congressional oversight activities that were protected by constitutional separation of powers principles. Congresswoman Crockett's activities match the profile of sophisticated election interference, Agent Williams told her team during a briefing. She's using her official position to access voter databases. She's making public statements that could undermine confidence in election integrity. And she's coordinating with outside organizations that have partisan political interests. We need to stop this before it affects the upcoming elections. The decision to arrest Crockett was made after FBI agents intercepted communications between her staff and voting rights organizations that appeared to show coordination in challenging voter registration processes. What the agents interpreted as evidence of a conspiracy to manipulate elections was actually documentation of the systematic suppression scheme that Crockett had been working to expose and prevent. On a Tuesday morning in October, just 6 weeks before the midterm elections, FBI agents arrived at a community center in South Dallas where Crockett was scheduled to hold a town hall meeting about voting rights and election access. The timing and location were chosen to minimize disruption, but the arrest of a sitting member of Congress on federal election crimes guaranteed maximum media attention and political controversy. Congresswoman Crockett, "I'm Agent Patricia Williams with the FBI," the lead agent announced as Crockett emerged from her car in the community center parking lot. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to interfere with federal elections, unauthorized access to election systems, and violation of federal election integrity statutes. You have the right to remain silent." The charges were serious enough to end her political career and send her to federal prison for decades. Crockett's reaction was immediate disbelief, followed by urgent concern about the timing of her arrest. "Agent Williams, you're making a terrible mistake," she said as handcuffs were applied. "I haven't interfered with any elections. I've been investigating systematic voter suppression that violates federal civil rights laws. My arrest is actually helping the criminals I've been trying to expose by stopping the investigation right before the election." But Agent Williams was convinced that she was dealing with a sophisticated criminal who would naturally claim to be conducting legitimate oversight rather than admitting to election interference. "Congresswoman, you've used your official position to access sensitive voter data, you've made public statements undermining election integrity, and you've coordinated with partisan organizations to challenge legitimate administrative processes. Your actions constitute serious federal crimes." As news of Crockett's arrest spread through social media and news networks, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Voting rights organizations denounced the arrest as an attempt to silence congressional oversight of election administration. Political opponents celebrated what they claimed was evidence that Democratic politicians were the real threat to election integrity. The controversy threatened to overshadow the actual voting rights violations that Crockett had been investigating. But while media attention focused on the political implications of arresting a sitting congresswoman, Crockett's staff made a decision that would ultimately vindicate her investigation and expose the FBI's mistake. They released the complete documentation of voter suppression that Crockett had assembled, including communications between state officials, statistical analysis of registration challenges, and evidence of systematic targeting of minority communities. The release of Crockett's evidence created an immediate shift in public understanding of her arrest. Instead of a member of Congress caught interfering with elections, The documentation showed a legislator who had uncovered genuine violations of federal voting rights laws and was being arrested for trying to protect democracy rather than undermining it. Dr. Maria Rodriguez, the voting rights expert who had been working with Crockett's team, held a press conference within hours of the arrest to present their findings to the public. Congresswoman Crockett discovered systematic voter suppression affecting thousands of Texas citizens. She announced, "Her arrest appears to be stopping the investigation of genuine election crimes, not preventing them." The evidence that Crockett's team had assembled was damning and comprehensive. Internal communications between state election officials showed deliberate coordination to challenge voter registrations in minority communities. Statistical analysis demonstrated that registration challenges were being applied selectively based on demographic and political criteria. Legal experts confirmed that the activities documented by Crockett's investigation violated multiple federal civil rights and election laws. As the evidence became public, FBI agent Williams began receiving urgent calls from her supervisors and Department of Justice officials who were reviewing Crockett's documentation and realizing that the federal investigation had been focused on the wrong target. Instead of investigating election interference, the FBI had arrested the person who was exposing genuine election interference by others. "Agent Williams, we need to review this case immediately," Deputy Attorney General Robert Hayes told her during an emergency conference call. "The evidence that Congresswoman Crockett assembled appears to document systematic voter suppression that we should have been investigating, not the congressional oversight that uncovered it. We may have made a serious error in focusing on her activities rather than the crimes she was reporting." Within 24 hours of Crockett's arrest, federal prosecutors were reviewing not just the evidence against her, but the evidence she had assembled against state election officials and the systematic voter suppression operation she had uncovered. What they found was a comprehensive case for federal civil rights violations that was far more serious than anything they had suspected Crockett of doing. The voter suppression scheme that Crockett had documented involved state election officials working with partisan political operatives to use sophisticated data analysis to identify and target specific categories of voters for registration challenges. The operation was designed to appear like legitimate election administration while systematically disenfranchising minority and Democratic-leaning voters without obvious evidence of discriminatory intent. This is exactly the kind of systematic voting rights violation that federal civil rights laws were designed to prevent, explained Assistant Attorney General Sarah Martinez during a Department of Justice briefing. Congresswoman Crockett's investigation uncovered evidence of crimes that we should have been prosecuting, not treating her oversight activities as criminal interference. The FBI was forced to release Crockett within 48 hours of her arrest, with all charges dropped and a formal apology from the Department of Justice for the mistake. But the damage to the voter suppression investigation was significant. The arrest had given state officials time to destroy evidence, modify systems, and prepare legal defenses against the federal charges that were now inevitable. Agent Williams personally apologized to Crockett for the mistake and requested her cooperation in the federal investigation of the voter suppression scheme she had uncovered. "Congresswoman, we made serious errors in our assessment of your activities. Your investigation was not only legal, it was exactly the kind of oversight that helps protect voting rights. We need your help to prosecute the actual crimes you discovered." Crockett's response demonstrated the grace and professionalism that had made her a respected voice in Congress. "Agent Williams, I understand that you were trying to protect election integrity, and I appreciate that your intentions were good even though your analysis was wrong. Of course, I'll cooperate with investigating the real crimes against voting rights. That's what I've been trying to do all along. The federal investigation that followed Crockett's release resulted in the largest voting rights prosecution in Texas history. 12 state election officials and political operatives were indicted on federal civil rights charges. The systematic voter suppression operation was dismantled, and new protections were implemented to prevent similar schemes in future elections. The evidence that Crockett had assembled became the foundation for successful federal prosecutions that resulted in prison sentences for the key figures in the voter suppression conspiracy. Her documentation was so thorough and professionally prepared that federal prosecutors called it one of the most comprehensive investigations of voting rights violations they had ever seen from a congressional office. 6 months after her arrest, Crockett was invited to speak at the Department of Justice about congressional oversight of voting rights and the importance of protecting democracy through aggressive investigation of suppression tactics. Her presentation was attended by federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and civil rights attorneys who wanted to learn from her successful investigation techniques. The voter suppression case became a national model for how systematic disenfranchisement operations could be identified and prosecuted. Crockett's methods were adopted by voting rights organizations and congressional offices across the country, leading to similar investigations that uncovered suppression schemes in multiple states. Agent Williams, meanwhile, became an advocate for better coordination between federal law enforcement and legislative oversight, acknowledging that her team's mistake had nearly allowed serious voting rights violations to continue undetected. She implemented new protocols for evaluating potential election interference cases that required consideration of whether reported activities might constitute legitimate oversight rather than criminal conduct. 1 year after her arrest, Crockett received the NAACP's highest award for voting rights advocacy, recognizing her investigation as a crucial contribution to protecting democracy and civil rights. The award ceremony was attended by many of the voters whose rights had been protected by her work, as well as federal officials who had initially arrested her for conducting the investigation. The congressional district where the voter suppression had been most concentrated saw a dramatic increase in voter participation following the prosecution of the suppression conspiracy. Thousands of citizens who had been improperly removed from voter rolls were restored to active status, and new protections were implemented to prevent future targeting of minority communities. For Crockett, the experience reinforced her belief that effective representation requires more than legislative votes and committee hearings. It demands active investigation and protection of constituents' fundamental rights. Democracy only works when people can participate, she often told audiences. Sometimes protecting that participation requires taking risks and challenging systems that seem legitimate but are actually corrupt. Today, the case of Jasmine Crockett's arrest for investigating voter suppression is studied in law schools and civil rights organizations as an example of how legitimate oversight can be confused with criminal activity and how protecting democracy sometimes requires challenging the very institutions that are supposed to safeguard it. The story serves as a powerful reminder that in our complex political system, the line between protecting election integrity and suppressing voting rights can be deliberately blurred by those who benefit from reduced participation. Crockett's willingness to risk her career and freedom to investigate systematic disenfranchisement demonstrates the kind of courage that democracy requires from its leaders. The case of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett being arrested for exposing voter suppression while being accused of election interference illustrates how easily legitimate oversight can be criminalized when it threatens powerful interests. Her story shows that sometimes protecting democracy means being willing to look like a criminal to those who profit from corruption, and that the most important investigations are often the ones that make the investigators themselves targets of the systems they're trying to reform.